the white American experience is going away. It's going extinct. You recognize that because of the demographic change in America, you have these ethnic enclaves from Latin America, from Asia, from Africa that are being set up all across the country. And it almost feels like those places they sort of they're more of a true representation of their home country than America is of what America used to be.
Hey guys, this is Peter Wiggin. In this video, Nick clarifies his views on demographic change in the United States. What does that mean? Lots of immigrants are coming in. Why is he against immigration? Isn't he the children of immigrants? Isn't he Italian? Isn't he a quarter Mexican? Let's get into the video. Let's see what him and Glenn Greenwald have to say on the subject.
Let's envision a world in which you have, let's say, quasi-dictatorial powers, which I think a lot of your followers ironically hope you have and some non-ironically hope that you have. What does that world look like in terms of, I don't mean people who are here legally or even recent immigrants? You've been very clear about your advocacy of mass deportation, which is a mainstream conservative view. It's what Trump ran and won on. But what about minorities who have been in this country for decades or centuries, generations, Black Americans, Latino Americans, Asian Americans, gay people? Like, what is the ideal vision of America that Nick Fuentes would shape in terms of how those groups would be treated?
Well, I think that for people that have been here for generations, you got to recognize there's always been non-white groups that have lived in a sort of regional basis across the country, whether it's Asians living in California, Hispanics living in the Southwest, Blacks living in the South because of slavery. I think that they should have the same rights and dignity as every other American. My only concern, and where it's born out of, the kind of nativist rhetoric, or even to that extent, white nationalist or white identitarian rhetoric, is the idea that the white American experience is going away. It's going extinct. You recognize that because of the demographic change in America, you have these ethnic enclaves from Latin America, from Asia, from Africa that are being set up all across the country. And it almost feels like those places they sort of they're more of a true representation of their home country than America is of what America used to be. In other words, it feels like going into certain neighborhoods in Minneapolis or in Ohio, that feels like a truer representation of Haiti or Somalia than most of America is to what America used to be 30 years ago. And so there does need to be something done with respect to that. And I think that what you might call that is something like voluntary segregation. People call it free association. People have talked about reversing the Civil Rights Act. My concern is not necessarily because we don't really live in America in a sense. We live in our neighborhood. America's a big country. It's always been a big country. The question is, can there be neighborhoods or cities or states where it still feels like America, where there's still mostly white people, still mostly Christians, still, bear some passing resemblance to what European civilization looked like for the past 1,000 years? That's sort of what I'm preoccupied with. And so I'm less concerned about, in the past, people have talked about an ethno-state or these kinds of things. The demographic change is baked in. At this point, there's millions upon millions of people that are not white that have been here for many years. If I could go in a time machine, I would undo this demographic change. We can't do that. I don't think it's practical, or I don't even think it'd be humane to try to reverse that at this point. On some level, America has to see itself no longer as a homogeneous republic, self-governing, and more like a true empire, more like a federalized system with a stark degree of multiracialism, ethnic and racial diversity. And I think we have to have that reflected in how the country's governed, how we manage relations between the races. I think that's something the government needs to undertake, is sort of an active management of the diversity. That Singapore does this, Ethiopia does this, many countries do it. America's not the same country as it was 100 years ago. We have to change to sort of reflect that fundamental change in the population. So that's sort of where I don't know if that's a great answer, but that's sort of how I think about it when I think about how we could all get along as a diverse nation.
I guess my question about that is, and you know this very well, if you go back and look over the last 100 years, which we can romanticize and idealize as this much greater time and better time of harmony and cultural cohesion, there was a big influx of all sorts of immigrants. I mean, people looked at Italians and people looked at Irish and people looked at Jews and Jewish immigrants and people looked at, you know, pretty much every single one of these groups as distinctly un-American, as a completely foreign influence, importing very un-American ideas, loyalties to their foreign country. You know, when even John F. Kennedy became the first Catholic president, there was this sense of, oh, he's not really American. His principal allegiance is to the Vatican. A lot of the rhetoric about the newest immigrants was very much similar to the ones about the ones from 100 years ago. I grew up in South Florida. There was this huge Cuban immigrant community, and a lot of the first generation immigrants were completely unassimilated. You know, they never even learned English. To this day, you can go to the Miami airport and have a hard time finding someone who speaks English. But their kids, you know, Marco Rubio and those types, Ted Cruz, to some extent at least, you know, you can argue in those cases to which extent, but to a lot of them, they became super assimilated, super American. I think you see that with a lot of Indian immigrants, a lot of Muslim immigrants. These people start going to college. They become doctors and lawyers. A lot of them are secular. They seem American in terms of how they speak and how they behave. Like, what to you is the difference, other than just numbers maybe, between immigrants of 100 years ago and the immigrants of now?
Well, difference is race. The immigrants of 100 years ago were racially European. And, you know, there's sub-races in Europe. People get at that. They talk about how the WASP natives of America didn't take a shine to the Italians, Irish, Jews, Slavs, et cetera, that came in. And with the exception of Jews, I don't consider Jews, they're sort of a distinct group, but they were all white. Italians are white, Irish are white, and that's why it was easy for them to assimilate. You know, my ancestors, most of them were white. I have one grandfather who's Mexican. The rest of my grandparents are Irish and Italian. They look like the native people. They practice Christianity, a different flavor of it. They come from the same continent. They're racially white. And I do believe that our race is a part of our distinct identity. And the people that are coming in now, they're Indian, they're Chinese, they're Hispanic, they're racially different. And I think people have, rightfully so, a lot of reservations about America going from a white country to a not white country, a country that was 90% white to a country that may be 70% not white. It won't look the same. It won't feel the same. It won't be the same. You know, and these are people with a completely different heritage, different religion, language. They look different. They just are different. And I don't have a problem with them in themselves. I'm Catholic. So, you know, we believe that every human being is created by God. We do believe there's a universal community of human beings, but you still have China, you still have India, you still have the Middle East and Africa. If America becomes a not white country, it's almost like we lose what's ours. And moreover, we're also losing it in Europe too. The European countries, they're undergoing the same transformation. And so, you know, there's this idea that we're going to be a post-racial country and live in a post-racial world. But it feels like white people are the ones that are going to be erased. There's still going to be Indians, Africans, Chinese, Peruvians in a post-racial world. But there won't be any white people. There won't be any white nations. White people won't have power. And that's disconcerting for white people. I'm white. I feel white. I look white. I want to be around people that look like me. That makes me comfortable. It makes me feel at home. And I think there's something tragic and there's something lost if, you know, our homes are being erased. Neighborhoods are no longer filled with the same people, no longer the same heritage, culture, customs. It's sort of like our race and our countries are going extinct. And that is the part that really makes it different than 100 years ago.
Yeah, I get that. At the same time, you know, even going back to like the 70s and 80s into the 90s, there was this liberal utopian dream that the way that liberals were going to exercise political power for eternity, essentially, is they were going to import enough immigrants from enough different countries in Latin America and elsewhere. And these people, by their very culture, by their very nature, were going to be more attracted to liberal politics than to conservative politics, which was hostile to them, and that it would essentially deliver to the Democratic Party and American liberalism kind of a permanent majority. And as you know, it turns out that a lot of these immigrants shocked a lot of these Democratic strategists because they're increasingly migrating to American conservatism. Huge amounts of supporters like them got behind President Trump, not Kamala Harris, not Joe Biden, not Barack Obama. Increasingly, they feel alienated by this kind of left-wing multiculturalism and much more in line with what people might call American conservative values. Has that surprised you, and it does in any way undermine these assumptions you have about the ability of different races to come in and really assimilate into the American ideal?
It has been surprising. It has. I would say, though, I think you might be overstating it a little bit, or other people might be overstating it. Really, the demographic that's come far in that regard is Hispanics. I don't know the numbers on Asians in 24, but it's not happening with African Americans, Black Americans as opposed to Africans from Africa. It's not. I don't believe it's really happening with East Asians or Asians. It's really only happening with Hispanics. And I think that Hispanics, unlike Asians and Africans, I'm not just saying this because I'm ethnically Mexican also, but Hispanics, people say there is some proximity with white people. A lot of Hispanics have a kind of white phenotype, and many of them see themselves as white. Some people say that's me, but I would say that's a lot of Hispanics. They maybe identify as white in a certain way, and maybe that explains why they were able to vote for the deporter-in-chief Donald Trump in 2024. I will say, though, it is a bit surprising. That was a big part of the thinking 10 years ago, is that, like you say, they're going to come here, they're going to vote Democrat forever, and the Democrats are going to increase the open borders. And, it's a sort of compounding effect, always more immigration. And so that's been a little bit surprising. But I would say that when you look at Trump's governance, now that he is really fulfilling, or by appearances fulfilling, mass deportations, the Hispanics are turning on him. And so the Hispanics that turned out in record numbers for Republican president in 24, if you look at the available polling, now that there's this media perception that Trump is enforcing deportations and going door to door, I discount the extent of this, but that's the perception. Now Hispanics are turning on Trump. And many of the attitudes on immigration are changing. And I would say beyond that, I don't know that the immigrants ever fully and really assimilate. You look at Black Americans, for example, they've been here for 400 years. Are African Americans assimilated? I would argue that they really represent a kind of distinct identity from white America. There's white America, there's Black America. Those are two completely different worlds. They talk differently, they act differently, different culture, vote differently. And you could argue, have they even assimilated? It's been 400 years. Obviously, they have a unique experience, but I think that politics...
Nick, just on that, I just want to interject that there were several years, and you may even think this, but certainly for several years, you were a very vocal and unironic advocate of the view that the political savior for the United States was not Donald Trump or any other white politician, but was Kanye West, who emerges very much out of Black culture, is an icon of Black musical culture and just kind of Black iconography in general. And this was the person who you believe, he became a very close friend of yours, still might be. You have a great deal of admiration for him. And not just admiration personally, but you really believe that politically he was the most promising agent for the kind of political and social change that you crave. Is that just aberrational, or does that say something about the integration of Black Americans into American culture after so many centuries?
Well, I think that there can be cooperation, but I would say that Ye, that's his name change now, he really is distinct. He does look at white people differently, I think, than Black people. I think that his politics were distinct because he is Black. Now, we happen to come into an alliance because of our agreement about confronting the Jewish media, about confronting Israel, and even upsetting the apple cart for Trump and the GOP. I think we both recognized that would be useful as native-born Americans. But just because we could come together on a political basis, I don't think it discounts that there's still there is still a bridge. Or you could say there needs to be a bridge built between us because we come from such different worlds. We're both from Chicago. He's from Hyde Park. I'm from LaGrange Park. Different worlds, different politics. And we probably agree, him and I, maybe on 50% of the issues. And one of them is a very unique issue. So I don't know that that's really a contradiction in terms. I think it just speaks to the fact that he is a unique individual. I don't think anyone would disagree with that in general, but I don't think that changes the fact that people of different races have very different politics in America, and I think that proceeds from their race.
Well, but conversely, just like sticking to that point, but looking at it from the other direction, there has been this kind of, I would almost say, consensus among people on the right, certainly among your precinct of the right, but even ones a little bit closer to the mainstream. You heard J.D. Vance talking about this, that on some level, the kind of bugaboo right now of American politics are highly educated, metropolitan, liberal white women who are just kind of the bane of everybody's existence, who are the plight and plague on American politics. These are the people responsible for so many of the worst political trends over the last 10 years, not just in terms of the ideas, but also how they're expressed, how the dialogue and discourse evolves. And I know that's something that you've talked about. I've heard you talk about white women in quite acrimonious ways, to be generous in terms of describing that. So what about that? What does that reflect? I mean, these are white women, like hardcore white women, probably with a long history of white ancestry in the United States. And yet for you and so many other people who think like you, these are like the embodiment of the threats to the American way of life. What's the explanation for that?
Well, I think in general, you're sort of conflating what is abstract versus what is real. White women have liberal ideas, but they carry white genes. And so white women have eggs that when fertilized by white men are going to create white babies. And white men and white women have been doing this for thousands of years, and they continue producing a race and ethnic group of people that look a certain way, act a certain way, speak a certain way. And, maybe this generation or a previous generation or, some other generation might have had the wrong idea or an idea that is contrary to my ideas, but they still carry those genes. They're still that distinct group of people. I'm not going to say that I'm in favor of America becoming minority white, because one black man has the right politics and most white women have the wrong politics in the current year in 2025. Because, all things being equal and kind of left in isolation in 100 years, those white women are going to ensure the continuation of people that look like me. And those black people are going to have generation after generation of people that seem to be sort of set against us in a certain way. There seems to always be, they're advocating on behalf of their group, insofar as they're a minority, and we as whites are in a sense doing that also, implicitly or explicitly. So I think maybe that's the conflation. There might be liberal white women, but they're still white, and I still think that white people should exist, even if there are a lot of liberal white people right now, because I'm white. So that's maybe because I was a libertarian for many years, and to me that was kind of the big inflection point for me, is realizing that I'm part of a group that is going extinct, and I don't want to go extinct. I want to thrive.
So I don't have a lot to say about this, but I want to recap saying that Nick has been one of the first people to bring this up. And I think this is one of the things that had brought him to the forefront in the first place. He was on Patrick Bet-David's show on Valuetainment a couple weeks ago, about 2 weeks ago, right? And he talked about this. He talked about his backstory. He used to be a libertarian until this was the thing that red-pilled him. He went to Boston University and he saw that this isn't like my hometown of Berwyn, Chicago, suburb. This is a completely foreign land. There are people here that don't share my values, that don't share my religion, that don't share my history. And this is actually what a lot of America is like nowadays. This isn't like Berwyn. I was living in a bubble. I was living it was pretty much like a time capsule of 50 years ago where everyone would watch baseball games. Everyone would meet together as a community and root sports teams and stuff like that, eat hot dogs on the streets. That's not what America is becoming. And that's what red-pilled him. He realized that I'm going to lose my home. And at the beginning, it's nothing against the people that are coming here. It's just the fact, pure and simple, that my home is changing. These people are bringing their values with them. It's diluting my home, and soon, very soon, that will disappear. My children won't be able to have the same upbringing that I did. And that's what red-pilled him. That was the origin story of our modern Joker. And so I agree with that. I agree the white American experience is going away. Now, you can debate the extent to whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. You have a lot of people on the left that are going to say that's a good thing. Now, I'm just saying that Nick has a home and he wants to preserve it. That's why he's talking about this. I live in Utah. It's pretty much a white enclave anyway, so I live in a bubble myself. Anyway, another question that's brought up are what are the differences between immigrants of 100 years ago and the immigrants of today? Glenn Greenwald, he does his homework very well on this, and he's a very good faith actor. He did his research on Nick Fuentes, and he understood a lot of his points and policy positions more holistically than any other interview I've seen. Talk to Fuentes, which I think is pretty, it's pretty admirable. Maybe Glenn Greenwald's a groyper. Green, it's in the last name. That's the color of groyper, right? Is that a dog whistle? Glenn? And so one of the things that Nick says is the big difference between the immigrants of 100 years ago and today is race. Now, I don't understand the race-realistic policy position that Nick Fuentes holds well enough to try to articulate it, and I did in a lot of trouble doing so. And so I'm not going to do that in this video, but you saw his explanation. That's one of the key differences between the immigrants of 100 years ago and the immigrants of today. And so, plain and simple, if you think that Nick Fuentes is hypocritical for saying that we shouldn't have immigrants in the country, and he's an immigrant himself, or the children of immigrants, or the grandchild of immigrants, then that's your answer. That's the difference. And maybe you don't think that's a good difference. Maybe you think that his argument is flawed, is faulty, and that's fine. But I think it's good that he's articulating these positions. I think it's good that he's been able to get on a bunch of big platforms. Tomorrow's Thursday. I don't know if I'll upload this video tomorrow, this evening. It's Wednesday at the time of this recording. But I think he has some big stuff in store for the rest of the week. Hopefully he can get on some more mainstream platforms and this generational run can continue. It's interesting stuff, whether you agree with it or not. These are things that, if you disagree with his idea on race realism, think about it, write about it, postulate your ideas, be able to argue with it. Anyway, this has been Peter Wiggin. I hope you enjoyed this clip. If you did, leave a like. Also, leave a comment at boosting the algorithm. More people can get this information and see Nick Fuentes. You can help facilitate the generational run. You'll be part of it. It's a movement, right? You're the motion that the movement depends on. We'll see you in the next one. Have a good one. Stay safe, y'all.